Hey everyone, it's Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming coming at you with another video. This time I'm talking about the Witcher books because it is Witcher month over at Heroic Studios Gaming, and much like my mistake in the past where I talked about a whole series of books at once instead of a single book, I'm going to do that again today because, why not? So we're going to be talking about the Witcher books. I'm actually really going to tell you like the overarching plot of them and sort of the history behind them, and their like dates of publication and translation. But let's just start talking about them. So The Witcher was actually written in 1986. It was a short story written by Andrej Sapkowski, who's the same writer who wrote all of these books. You can see his name right over there. He wrote the story called The Witcher, or that's its English translation anyway, for a competition for a Polish sci-fi magazine known as sci-fi fantasy magazine called Fantastica. And he won third place. So it won a pretty decent place. It could have won more, and it should have won more, but unfortunately, he covered a couple of topics that weren't necessarily something that the magazine wanted to promote. Firstly, it was fantasy, which was still considered a his genre, even though it was a sci-fi fantasy magazine. So that sort of knocked it down a peg. But then it also got knocked down a peg because it sort of part of the story, or one major aspect of the story, was an incestuous congress between a king and his sister. Not that it's shown, it's just discussed, but that was enough for them to think it was a little too adult to win, like, first place. So they bumped it down to third place because the Game of Thrones mania wasn't a thing back then, and so you couldn't just get away with that kind of thing. So it kind of got third place. But in 86, that didn't discourage Sapkowski from continuing to write, and he continued to write a series of short stories involving this character known as Geralt, the Witcher, and then like this quote-unquote society of witchers that supposedly existed. And so he continued to write until 1992 when he published a series of these short stories in The Sword of Destiny, and then immediately the next year with The Last Wish, which basically was other stories. And so these two books of stories, The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny, they're just a series of short stories that are not in chronological order, but if you read the two books, you can figure out the chronological order in your head, because it's pretty simple. And actually, you should probably read The Last Wish first, because the stories in The Last Wish are chronologically kind of earlier than the stories in The Sword of Destiny. And so if you read The Last Wish first, you actually get a stronger understanding of the chronology. I actually read The Sword of Destiny first, and then I read The Last Wish, and I had to cross in my brain where all of these things came together. So I would recommend reading The Last Wish first if you were going to try to read the Witcher stories. But they're essentially stories that involve this main titular character, the Witcher, whose name is Geralt, who's quote-unquote of Rivia, but he also describes that in The Last Wish on like why he doesn't necessarily think that's the greatest thing. It's the best moniker for him because he's from Rivia, but he didn't really grow up in Rivia, so he's like, I don't know, but fine. He actually says that himself. He starts to describe himself. He says Geralt of, and then he stops, and then he explains why he's not really interested in doing that. But it explains his interest or his exploits as a monster hunter, and these stories in these first two books introduce us to the greater cast of characters that become much more important as the third book and onward becomes a cohesive, singular story that you have to read in order. But it introduces us to Jaskier, a.k.a. Dandelion the Bard, Yennefer of Vengerberg, Cirilla of Sintra, Mousak the Druid, Emir von Emrys, Queen Calanthe, and of course Roach, the horse that is the name of every horse that the Witcher has. So we're introduced to these characters in these stories so that we can understand what's going on in the world. And if you read them, like I said, The Last Wish and then The Sword of Destiny as shown here, right there, then you're going to be able to understand it much, much better. But technically, The Sword of Destiny was published first. It was published in 1992 in Polish and wasn't translated into English until 2007. The Last Wish was published in 1993 and actually wasn't translated into English until like 2013. So for those of us in the American world, we actually have had no idea that these books could be read in that order. So some lists might show them in publication order, and some lists might show them in chronological order. The technical chronological order is The Last Wish and then The Sword of Destiny. But they're fairly interchangeable, so it really doesn't matter in which way you read them. Like I said, I read The Sword of Destiny first, and then I read Last Wish, and it's fine. You can do that. But there's not really there's kind of an overarching plot, but it's really establishing the overarching plot of the later books. So you don't need to worry about like the overarching plot or anything. You can read them in whatever order you want. 2015, actually, was when it was translated in English. Book 3, The Blood of the Elves, is the start of the overarching actual story. It was published in 94. Wasn't translated into English until 2008, so it did come right behind The Sword of Destiny, so people could kind of understand what was going on, and it starts the novelization. However, the next book in the series wasn't translated into English until 2013. That's where my 2013 confusion came. But it was translated into English after that. So it was Time of Contempt, Baptism of Fire, Tower of Swallows, and then Lady of the Lake, which is actually the full story. The Season of Storms, shown right there, is actually a very recent book. It was written and translated in 2018. It's actually the latest in the series, and it doesn't actually follow the story arc. So the story arc sort of ends with the Lady in the Lake, and then the Storm of Swords is like its own separate story. So I haven't actually read this one, the Season of Storms, because it just doesn't really fit. I read the rest of them and got the whole story, and then I never really read that one, though I probably should. But it takes place it's like an epilogue story. It takes place much later than the other stories, so it's not super important. But anyway, in 2007. CD Projekt Red, which is a Polish gaming company who also made the games, right? They also made Cyberpunk 2077. They wanted to make this book series into a video game, so they did, and it was a video game called The Witcher. Because it got international recognition for The Witcher 2, so the first one was not super recognized. The second one became really popular really fast because people had been playing the first one for a little while, and then were like, oh, this is actually kind of good. Let's tell our friends about it, and let's tell our friends about the second one, which was coming out. So they released it, and so because of the second one, they decided to start translating the books into English, and that's why we got the translations of these books, and that's why we got The Sword of Destiny and Blood of the Elves in 2007 and 8. It would have been better to do The Last Wish, but I don't know why they didn't. Anyway, they became popular, and then it continued to be popular, as the games were going. And then the second one came out, everyone started playing it, had a huge fan base, and that was when they started translating the other ones. The second one came out in 2013, 2012 or something. Anyway, they started publishing the rest of them, and so that's why the rest of them started getting translated into English, but they started with the story, the overarching story first. That's why The Last Wish wasn't translated until 2015. So we actually got Time of Content in 2013, Baptism of Fire 2014, then The Last Wish in 2015, which harkened back to the beginning, and then Tower of Swallows in 2016, Lady of the Lake in 2017, and then Storm of Swords was written and translated basically at the same time in 2018. And so that's how they were published. Now, the overarching story essentially is that there's this character, the Witcher. He's doing his own monster hunting thing, and the nation of Nilfgaard, the Empire of Nilfgaard, invades the Northern Kingdoms. So in this world that's established, and one of the best things about these books is the world building that goes on. I mean, already we have this guild of monster hunters called the Witchers, who are needed but also reviled, right? Nobody really likes them, and lots of people like to try to get out of paying them for hunting monsters. And the other thing is too, like these monsters too, there's like two ways that monsters are created, and oftentimes monsters are created by curses. So that's one thing the Witchers do, is like they kill the monsters, but sometimes they address the underlying curse. Usually they're created out of monstrous events and things. And so the Witchers are dealing with the sort of aftermath of human-monster interaction or human-to-human interaction. In the case of the story that I was mentioning, the incestuous thing with the king and his sister, the baby that is created, the sister is killed by a curse, and so the baby that is born out of her cursed death is actually a monster. It's a Striga. And there is a way to break the curse, in which the Witcher understands this, but he also knows that the thing will kill. So he tells the king that, yeah, okay, maybe I can, but I might just kill her depending on what happens. So there's this like thing about how monsters are created, and they're all created their own way. They're all reasons for their creation. And so there's sort of this weird line between like, what is a monster? Is a human a monster? Is a monster a monster? Is a monster a human? And there's like this sort of moral play that goes on in the stories, and it's a real moral play. Like the Witchers understand this, but they also have to deal with the actual physical, the actual like tangible thing of like it kills people. And also, as he expresses, like, okay, maybe I can save this baby, that not make it a Striga anymore, but it's gonna be messed up. Like, it's going to have memories and things and know that it's killed people and stuff and know what the taste of blood is and things like that. So even if I do save them, they're still going to probably be monsters. But anyway, the overarching story is that Nilfgaard invades this. So Nilfgaard is a southern kingdom and invades the northern kingdoms of Sintra, Redarnia, Temeria, etc. And there's a whole lot of socio-political stuff that goes on with that, as there's this massive migration of people and monsters that result. And Geralt is mixed up in all of this because the socio-political mess that is being created by all of this does make more work for him. But we find out, based on the stories in The Last Wish and other stories, that Geralt is his fate, his destiny is tied directly to Cirilla of Sintra, the princess and granddaughter of Queen Calanthe. So he's like, there's this whole problem that he has where he's kind of really tied up in all of this. Well, Sintra is invaded by Nilfgaard. He is thrown into this mix because his destiny and Cirilla of Sintra's destiny are linked together. She, however, is linked to the world's magic. She's some kind of magic user connected to the source. That's what all the magic users in this world call, like, the source of magic. Her fate is tied directly to that and the bargain that Geralt made much earlier on, which appears in The Last Wish. And so she's trying to survive all of this crazy socio-political stuff that's happening, and Geralt, no matter how many times he tries to run away from her, ends up getting caught back up in it. But then there's this other side to his destiny. Yennefer of Vengerberg is a wizard, sorceress person that The Witcher has kind of fallen in love with, and due to some choices that he made and some things that he did at a certain time, he's like in love with this person, and he accidentally ties her destiny to him. So his destiny is tied to Cirilla, and Yennefer's destiny is tied to Geralt. So these three characters are sort of stuck in this fate triangle where they have to kind of work together no matter what goes on, because no matter how much they try to run away from it, they get caught right back up into each other. So over the course of the stories, Geralt, Yennefer, and Cirilla get pulled apart, got back together, get pulled apart again. And in that time, Geralt builds a typical Hansa, a typical group of travelers who are doing this stuff to try to help all of these things. Some of them are people like Jaskier, who's just a bard who's caught up in this. Some of them are Nilfgaardian. Some of them are Cintran. Some of them are people that are tied directly to it. And so we kind of see all this. I'm not going to spoil the whole story for you, but the ending was not a complete surprise. Like the ending of this whole drama between Ciri and Geralt and Yennefer and Emir von Emrys and all of this stuff, it all kind of comes together into the end. It's not that much of a surprise. I mean, it's a surprise. Don't get me wrong. It is a surprise. It surprised me, but the twist was not unexpected. Like, after the twist, I went back to like kind of look back and was like, oh yeah, they laid that down pretty heavily. Chekhov's gun style in The Last Wish starts this whole thing off, and it becomes like one of those moments where you're just like, oh my god. But unlike, say, Game of Thrones, which is another sort of epic story fantasy thing, it actually doesn't get boring at any point. Even in the low parts of the story, there's still really cool stuff. And every time that the story starts to get politically boring, Sapkowski has a really good way of reminding us that Geralt is a monster hunter, and so he'll throw in monsters and things that are doing stuff that keep us entertained. But then also the story of Cirilla and what she's doing at one point when she's separated from everybody is also quite good. So, and overall, the story is engaging at all points. Whenever it jumps to, okay, we're going to be following Cirilla for a while, I'm like, cool, I want to know more about what's going on with her. She's up to some cool stuff. And now we're going to jump over to Yennefer for a minute. Okay, that's kind of boring socio-political stuff, but don't worry, it's going to be short, and then we're going to jump back to Geralt killing something in a cave. It's like, okay. So that's cool. It's cleverly done world building. It's cleverly done plot development. It's cleverly done character. And the action sequences are beautiful. There's this scene where Geralt is fighting in The Last Wish. I'll just go back to The Last Wish. In The Last Wish, which is one of our, if you're reading it in order, one of the first combat sequences we see is Geralt fighting a Striga. And the way that the fight is described with the spinning and the twisting and the pulling is very cool. Then there's another scene in that book later where Geralt is fighting a Bruxa, and he's dealing with that, and that description is just as awesome. It's completely different. Geralt fights that thing in a different way than he fights the Striga, and in that way there's this whole thing where he does a blade cut and then puts it on his shoulder and then twists his body to pull through. And it's described in detail how that's going on. So very cool writing for action sequences. There's a little bit more sex than I generally like in my books, but that's fine. I can overlook those things. I can usually just kind of skip it if I don't want to keep reading. But for like, just cool stuff. And also for funsies, Sapkowski wrote a whole language. He created Elder Speak, which is a language that like most of the monsters know, and then like some of the where monsters have this Elder Speak sort of scrawled on the walls and stuff. It's very cool language that he then uses also for like the naming of places. So it's not like Polish names to all of the towns and like the countries and their castles and things all have this name in their names in Elder Speech. So it was not translatable because it wasn't a thing that could be translated, and so the names remained or were retained when they translated into English. So like an example of something that was translated in English wrong was Jaskar's name. Jaskar the Bard, his name is Dandelion in Polish, so they translated it into the English version as Dandelion. But if you've seen the show, you know that they kept the original Polish name. In the case of the translation of like Sintra and some of the Vengerberg, right? These names, they're not translatable. They're just places in the Elder Speech name, so they just kept them, which made it very cool and immersive for the rest of us instead of having a name like Dandelion the town, right? So that's what I say. So overall, 2 thumbs up for me about this book series, and very cool, very fun read. I would suggest that if you don't want to read the whole thing, because you don't necessarily need to, just read like The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny, and that'll get you enough of the story that if you decide you want to read ahead, you can totally do it. But you can just read those 2 and get like The Witcher's like witcherness, which leads into like the show that was created by Netflix, which I will cover in a different video. But yeah, I would suggest that. So I'll give 2 thumbs up to the series, but also like really 2 thumbs up to The Last Wish and The Sword of Destiny, if that's all you wanted to read as like just a bunch of short stories that involve The Witcher and The Witcher stuff. There's also a series of comics, which I will get into later, but the series of comic books are their own entity. They didn't try to take the stories from the books and turn them into comics. They wrote their own stories, some of which Sapkowski helped with, or some of which were Sapkowski's stories that weren't translated in English and are not part of any of the books that they then borrowed and translated into English to make the comics. So, so we'll talk about that later. But yeah, that's my review of the Witcher series. It's very well done, especially if you like sort of fantasy stuff, because it's a sort of interesting fantasy that also uses some modernness to it. So it's very cool. So I will go ahead and leave you with that, and I will say goodbye for now.